Hello and welcome. My name is Caroline Noralicetti, and I'm the president of the French American Foundation, United States. We're delighted to have so many guests from both sides of the Atlantic tuning into today's webinar on quantum technology. This program is a part of our cybersecurity webinar series, which complements the Foundation's annual two-day cybersecurity conference, which this year is scheduled for December 9th and 10th in Washington, D.C. I'm excited to introduce today's featured speaker, Dr. Kate Weber. Kate leads governance, including internal governance and government relations and policy, for Google's quantum computing team, Google Quantum AI. Previously, she led global public policy for emerging technologies at Google and has worked at the U.S. State Department as an American Association for the Advancement of Science, Science and Technology Policy Fellow. She holds a PhD in molecular biology from the University of Cambridge, where she was a Marshall Scholar, and a BS in biochemistry and molecular biology from the University of Richmond. Before the program begins, please know that this conversation is being recorded, and the video will be available to watch on the Foundation's YouTube channel post-event. I will now hand the program over to our moderator, Maura Sullivan, Managing Director for Applied AI at Applied Materials, and a FAF Young Leader 2020. Thank you, Maura.
Thank you, Caroline. Welcome to this seminar on quantum computing and its implications for cybersecurity. And we're lucky to have Kate Weber with us today. Before we get into the cyber applications for quantum, can you tell us a little bit about the background of quantum? I know the first serious look at quantum computing arose in kind of 1982 with Richard Feynman, when he said some of the problems that were intractable with classical binary computing methods might be solvable with quantum methods. So explain a little bit about those advantages for those types of problems and where quantum computing has gone over the last 40 years.
Yeah, definitely. So quantum computing relies on a fundamental different way of storing and processing information, right? So Maura, you mentioned binary. Classical computers code information as binary in the form of either a 0 or a 1, these classical bits. Quantum computers store information in quantum bits or qubits, which behave according to the principles of quantum mechanics, which is, if you've had like some physics courses somewhere in your background, you may remember that materials, when you get down to the very small like, subatomic level, behave differently than the materials we see around us in the natural world. And so we can exploit that, and these quantum bits can do things like communicate with each other about the states that they're in. They can be in a 0 or a 1 state, but they can also be in all states at the same time until you've measured them. That property is similar to the Schrodinger's cat analogy you may have heard of, right? Where once you like open the box with Schrodinger's cat in it, like then you can't, once you've measured it, like you can't tell where it is basically. So we can rely on these properties to do different kinds of calculations than we could do on a classical computer. It's not the case that quantum computers are expected to replace all classical computers, that they will be just more powerful versions of classical computers, but rather that there are certain kinds of algorithms that are essentially impossible to solve on a classical computer that we will be able to solve on a quantum computer in the future. And in terms of, sorry, I realized I didn't answer the other part of your questions, is just developments in this technology, right? So what we have over the past, I would say, for a long time, so Feynman came out with this idea. There were people kind of working on an academic scale on this problem for a long time. But I would say in the past 5 to 10 years is where we've really seen an increased investment, interest, and progress in the technology on the industrial side. There have been some very big sort of proof of principle leaps in recent years to show that it is actually possible to build one of these quantum computers that works. We at Google showed in 2019 that we could run an algorithm on a quantum computer that would take 10,000 years at the time on the world's best supercomputer. We also recently showed that we can scale up the number of qubits we use for a calculation while reducing their error very slightly. One of the biggest challenges in building a big quantum computer is that qubits are very error prone. So there are these kinds of early proof of principle work happening, and there's a lot of investment and plans to essentially scale up the technology and build what's known as a fault-tolerant quantum computer within the next 10 years. And many companies have come out with roadmaps that are sort of on that scale. At the moment, most quantum computers have on the order of 100 qubits. We think we'll need about 1 million qubits to get to that fault-tolerant computer. And by fault-tolerant, we mean a quantum computer that can run essentially indefinitely without these errors causing it to fail. Yeah.
So that's fascinating, right? I think we saw a similar kind of evolution with AI, where we saw kind of very slow progress, incremental progress, and then we saw this tipping point, and we've seen it in the last kind of 5 years where the transformer algorithm popped up and everything came ubiquitous with AI. Do you see quantum being a bit more incremental, or are we hitting that sort of tipping point where we might actually see a huge leap forward in what we can do, say, in the next decade?
Yeah, I think in the scale of the next decade, we likely will see a big leap in what we can do. I'm not sure it will be as quick of a switch as we maybe have seen in generative AI over the last year and a half, which I think is part of what is causing a lot of sort of public and policymaker concern. And the reason for that is we need to do a lot of advancement on the hardware and the component technology for these computers. And those are not things that develop super, super quickly, right? It's not like you would just could develop a new algorithm one day and run it on a huge existing piece of hardware, which is essentially kind of what is happening in generative AI. Very simplified, of course. There have been a lot of hardware developments that have made that possible, but those have been in the pipeline for a long time. And the thing that happened was the release of ChatGPT that sort of showcased the power of that. For quantum computers, like I said, we have about 100 qubits on a chip right now, 100 to 1 million. That's a huge scaling, not just in what you're building on the chip, but also each of those qubits at the moment has multiple wires to send information to it, to read out information to it, to control the qubit. At least there are different kinds of qubit technologies that have different supporting technologies. But for our quantum computers, which are what we call superconducting qubit based, that's the case. Our chips are in these big solution refrigerators to cool them down to 10 millikelvin, almost absolute zero. They're very, very cold. Those solution refrigerators are going to need to get a lot bigger. We're going to need to figure out a way to fit all this wiring and electronics in, which is probably going to require innovations in what those look like. So I think there are so many moving parts, and the hardware innovation side, I think, just takes a bit longer. So I wouldn't expect it to happen on the scale of a year or two.
Yeah, working for a semiconductor manufacturing company, I know that getting to manufacturability is very different. They're very different than getting to a prototype. But so I think that's one of the things that makes quantum interesting, right? And then we have this race with a prototype, or the first entity that has that prototype may have a significant advantage, right? Because I mean, in the 1990s, it was shown that Shor's algorithm would be ideal for factoring of large numbers, right? Which has been sort of that powerful force for investment, that virtuous cycle of investment, because it would potentially, theoretically, allow you to break commonly used cybersecurity protocols like RSA. And you don't necessarily need that to be manufacturable to have one or two that are breaking encryption protocols. So can you talk a little bit about the encryption protocol side, and then what that means for development and what that may mean for asymmetric development?
Yeah. So this is, we have several well-characterized applications for these mature fault-tolerant quantum computers. But the best known and the most well-characterized, I think most people would say, is this ability to solve Shor's algorithm, which would break most public key encryption that we use today, because that encryption is based on very large numbers, and Shor's algorithm can factor those numbers. And so the number of this is I think one of the driving forces behind the large amounts of investments we've seen in the technology, both in the government space and from venture capitalists. It's also behind a lot of policy interest and action in quantum computing. The concern, of course, as you say, is if somebody develops the first one of these large quantum computers that's capable of factoring large numbers, of solving Shor's algorithm, they probably are not going to tell the world about it. They only need one of them to do a lot of this decryption. And that's a huge risk to national security, to other banking systems, all of the systems that require encryption to protect information. Now, this is not, to be clear, I don't think there's anybody in the field that would say, oh, we need to worry about this happening in a year or two. This is very solidly in this fault-tolerant realm, and not even, if we say we expect to need 1 million qubits for the first fault-tolerant quantum computer, we expect to need about 10 million to solve Shor's algorithm. So I think it's pretty safe to say that it's not going to happen before 2035-ish. But that's not to say we don't need to worry about it now. Number one, it's a big enough risk that we should be ready several years before we expect it to possibly happen, right? Number two is there's this risk that we know that malicious actors are downloading encrypted data now, storing it so that they can be ready to decrypt it when they have a quantum computer. So for any data that we want to be secure in 10 years from now, we should be migrating it as quickly as possible to what we call post-quantum cryptography. And there are known algorithms that are cryptographic algorithms expected to be resistant to quantum computers. And I can talk more about the process to standardize those. But that is, it's not there is a solution. It's definitely not super easy. We know how to implement it, but it's not an easy task.
Because essentially you're saying that all of the previously generated encrypted data with things like RSA would have to be re-encrypted using post-quantum, or it will be vulnerable. So all of those passwords that you had that are used in multiple places, even if some of them are post-quantum, you'd have risk.
Yes, and there are efforts underway to begin this. We've seen announcements from some companies, where Apple announced that iMessage is deploying post-quantum encryption. There is a lot of work at Google to migrate our systems. I think that those efforts will really accelerate once the standardization process is complete. That is now, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, started a process to standardize these algorithms in 2017, and it involved various stages of public input, including from researchers at various companies, including Google. Some of the algorithms were authored by Google researchers. And that is just now in its final stages. We expect the final algorithms to be announced in the next couple of months. And I think many have been holding off on this transition because you don't want to actually migrate to something that you don't know is going to be the standard, right? There is also lots of work, though, that can be done to prep for doing inventories. It's actually really hard to know all of the things that you need to migrate. So one big challenge is inventorying what you have. And there are different kinds of cryptographic keys that need to be inventoried. my understanding, some of the hardest are like things like, roots of, so there are multiple challenges. There are like signatures for documents. Apparently there are many, many different kinds of those, and it's sort of harder to track them down than it is to look at the encryption for information that's being sent from one place to another, encryption in transit. That's where we think most about this store now, decrypt later challenge, where you're downloading the encrypted information. It's also, I think, I understand, a relatively straightforward problem to address, in that there are not that many algorithms that are currently deployed that you would need to shift. So I guess that's good news, in that that's like the kind of most urgent threat.
So you've just touched on so many different things here. The interplay between the public and the private sector, who essentially has responsibility for some of this encryption, who mandates it. So I guess starting from your position at Google, can you talk a little bit about, you're a multinational. You have to think about what these rules might look like across all the countries that you operate, which have their own quantum initiatives and approach. How do you see the standards rolling out globally? And then how do you see the role of these, large multinationals in implementing standards, but also kind of protecting data going forward?
So I think pretty much every company would tell you that they want standards to be harmonized, right? We do not want to have different standards in the different countries that we're operating in. The good news for this space is that it seems that in terms of the algorithm standardization, pretty much all countries are looking to the NIST process to identify algorithms. I think there is some difference in, there are multiple kinds of algorithms coming out of this NIST process, and there is some difference in which of those countries are interested in taking up and adopting in their own standards. But that is okay. We expect, to have some different kinds of algorithms out there, and if they're all based on this process, from our perspective, that's positive. But for example, there is even some, I think, disagreement between US stakeholders or just different plans on which of these algorithms to deploy. Like the NSA really likes what's called lattice-based cryptography, and others on the US side are not planning to implement that. I believe European bodies are not as keen on those. There is also the algorithms will be standardized, but then they need to be deployed in different contexts and for different kinds of cryptography, and there will be standards processes on top of the algorithms standardization on kind of how these are deployed, what the standard APIs are for deploying some of them. And so that is something to watch too. And hopefully those can also be harmonized as much as possible. In terms of the role of multinationals in kind of protecting data and also, I guess, participating, I think it's important for us to be participating in these various standards processes, since companies like Google hold a lot of consumer data, a lot of sensitive data, and it's sort of core to our business to protect it. So very important to us, and also important to the consumer. We also have, a lot of expertise in doing this. And so I think important for us to be engaged in these standards processes, to share what we are doing, and hopefully can help. We're starting to publish some blog posts on this topic, and help to educate others in this space to migrate quickly as well, and just be aware of this issue and the need to take action.
So again, you touched on a number of different things here, but first going back to kind of the approach to algorithms. And I know in cybersecurity, right, that there's some sort of core philosophies where a more heterogeneous environment can be almost more difficult to figure out, right? Because you can't sort of crack a single algorithm. So are there thought processes about, should we think about maybe having slightly more approaches to cryptography going forward, seeing as our past approach, a lot of it is vulnerable to this quantum? And how is that debate playing out and where?
Yeah. So a couple of points on that. One is that I think many in this space plan to implement the post-quantum cryptography on top of existing cryptography, so kind of like a multi-layered approach. And part of the rationale there is that having multiple lines of defense is helpful. Obviously, only the post-quantum cryptography, the PQC algorithm, would be resistant to the quantum computers, but we also see other kinds of, we'll continue to see other kinds of attacks. And there's some concern that these PQC algorithms haven't yet been deployed in the wild and could be vulnerable to other kinds of attacks. And so I think there are many who are going to take that approach. That, of course, there are logistical challenges. There may be kind of challenges in how long it takes to, if that could affect latency for certain operations, et cetera. On the topic of, more heterogeneity, I think everybody would agree. I know when you talk to NIST, they would say that it's not like this process is going to end and that's it. These are the standards, full stop. They expect to continue to add algorithms to these standards as they're developed. And I think that is particularly important because you do see cryptographic algorithms being broken. And it's reasonable to assume that maybe some of these will not actually be resistant to quantum computer or won't be resistant, as quantum computers continue to develop. It is the quantum computing algorithms development itself is quite a nascent field. There are not a ton of experts in that space. And one would expect that as the technology develops, we will also have more experts and thus more people working on these problems, thinking of new ways to use quantum computers, including new ways to break cryptography. And so it makes sense to continue iterating on the cryptography side too.
Yeah, one of the areas that I find very fascinating, right, is quantum computers are really good at certain things. Classical computers are good at other things. And so we're going to see these computing environments that are going to contain interfaces between quantum and classical. So is there any thought to, how you think about protecting those interfaces between your quantum and classical compute?
It's a great question. And I think this is an area where honestly, we're just starting to focus as we start to build these larger scale quantum computers. And we have been having some early conversations with academic collaborators, et cetera, to just increase the body of research on this. What are the vulnerabilities for that interface as we look to the future where we'll be building these quantum data centers? Obviously Google knows a lot about securing data centers, but what would the unique vulnerabilities be in a quantum data center that we might need to think about?
So I think that brings a little bit of the geopolitics of this too. So, we haven't really talked about, the United States, China, Russia, the EU, they all have well-defined quantum initiatives, both in terms of building quantum compute capacity and as well as kind of these standard aspects. Can you kind of compare and contrast what you're seeing globally and how you might see the geopolitics play out over the next few years?
Yeah. So for sure, the sort of overriding influence on the geopolitical side here is concern about China's development of the technology versus development in the US and the West. And that is certainly what is driving a lot of the US policymaker concern on the topic. And I think sort of some of the EU concern as well, though there's also this dynamic of the EU countries being concerned about too much of the technological power being located in the US too. So where we are, the Chinese government is investing huge amounts in this technology. The numbers I'm sure it's not very easy to get very clear numbers on Chinese investments of this kind, but the thinking is somewhere in the range of $15 billion a year. And the investment is primarily from government sources. In the US, there is government investment. There is a national there's a national quantum initiative that needs to be renewed. And hopefully that will happen soon. I think everybody's aware of the state of Congress these days. And so, we'll see how fast that happens. But about 5 years ago, we got a national quantum initiative. There's in the US, I would say probably more of the investment is happening in the private sector. And US private sector companies are widely acknowledged as the leaders in the quantum computing hardware space, along with one group in particular in China. And then there is a robust startup ecosystem in Europe as well. And then you also have various quantum computing software focused companies. You have the supply chain, which is super important. There are some of the very important supply chain players are located in Europe. So it's not like everything is concentrated in one country. And I would say government investments are playing a role in all places, but much more of a role in China than in the West.
All right, so I'm going to ask you a follow-up question on the approaches, but what I want to do right now is for anybody in the audience, if you would like to ask Kate a question, if you could just type your question into the question box, and then we'll go ahead and start asking questions as they come in. So in follow-up to what you just said, so some of the current approaches are fairly expensive and specialized in terms of environment. You talked about supercooled environments, equipment, capabilities. Who's likely to have access, and how does the access to quantum computing resources likely to play out here?
Yeah, this I think is a very important consideration. Yeah, so most of these technologies are very expensive to develop. I talked a bit about superconducting quantum qubits, which many of the leading hardware makers are building, and they require pretty extensive infrastructure. They also require access to helium-3, which is a material that is somewhat limited, and there's so there are discussions on the supply chain end around that. The access point. So yes, this will, the people building the hardware will need to have a lot of resources. So I think that's kind of will limit access to companies who are resourced to do that to wealthy governments. There are a lot of, I would say, burgeoning conversations about this as an ethics question. Who has access? Of course, it's quite complicated because there are also these national security concerns around access to these quantum computers. And so there's a question of how do we make this accessible to as many people as possible for positive applications, and also restrict access for these risky purposes. And I think people have different answers to that and different ideas of who should and shouldn't have access. So there are some things we can learn, of course, from what's happened in the AI, the cloud computing space. And we do expect that most access to quantum computers will happen via the cloud, given the cost of building them.
Yeah, yes, most people can't have that much coolant in their basement. It's a pretty energy intensive process as well.
I don't think personal quantum computers will be a thing for the foreseeable future. I think even for large institutions, it's unlikely that most would have a quantum computer, in the lab, if they're not actually a quantum computer maker.
Yeah, we got a question sort of on the chip technology needed for quantum computers. And I think that goes to sort of what you're saying. If you maybe expound a little bit on the different approaches that are being taken. And some of the hardware required, some of the materials required. As I said, for me, I'm in the traditional silicon semi side, and we even are thinking about what is some of our equipment is going to be needed for quantum. So how do you see these different kind of competing current approaches to hardware technology developing, and how do you see that changing who might have access and at what scale there might be access?
Yeah. So for superconducting chips, the actual chips are aluminum and silicon. So Google has a dedicated fab facility. All of our hardware is in California, in Santa Barbara, California. So we have a fabrication facility there to make these chips. And it is true that many of the pieces of equipment that we use for that are also used in like advanced semiconductor production. I of course know less about the other chip architectures, but I can talk a bit there. So there's some of the other leading contenders for building this fault-tolerant quantum computer are ion trap quantum computers. So you basically have a channel, you're trapping a charged ion, and that's serving as the qubit. There are neutral atom quantum computers. There are photonic quantum computers. So in all of those cases, you don't need to make these things super cold. I think there are some common supply chain needs on kind of the electronics side. There are also some of these other architectures rely a lot on advanced laser technology to manipulate qubits. And so that's an area I know that in those cases, like for us, we have a global supply chain, but we are not reliant on Chinese suppliers, which is important with regard to this geopolitical conversation, right? In some of these other cases, there is that, not to say that they're reliant on the Chinese suppliers, but I think there are more, like in the laser space, more Chinese companies that are making some of those components. I unfortunately don't know like a ton of detail around like exactly what the needs are in every single one of these different qubit architectures, but suffice it to say there's a lot of non-overlapping component technology that would need to be developed to support the mature industry, and we won't know, I don't think, for a number of years like really which qubit architecture will be used to build the first fault-tolerant quantum computer.
Yeah, so that, this is a little bit of a side, but I think this is really important because with classical computing, especially with the rise in some of what we've seen in AI, I mean, right now, I think our compute energy needs are just surpassing that of the global aviation industry, which is a lot of CO2 emissions. So I know some of the methods may have energy advantages, some may have disadvantages. Do you see quantum being helpful in the sustainability of compute? And how will that play out?
So I think to our earlier conversation, we don't anticipate quantum computers replacing classical computers. Like largely they'll be used to solve different problems. So in that sense, I think it's not as if we can say, oh, like there's all these classical data centers with high emissions, but now some of that work can be done by a quantum computer, so it will be a net gain. Some of these early analyses of like current quantum computers and emissions have shown that they are a bit lower than classical computers, like per compute power, but it's obviously like it depends on how the technology develops, and I don't think there's been a ton of comprehensive work in that space. So it's something to pay attention to think early about what we can do for efficiency. I mean, there's a lot that's been done on the classical data center side to make them more efficient, and there's a lot of work still to do, even around just like thinking about where you locate them and the sustainability, the energy sources that are available geographically. I think hopefully we can take some of those learnings into quantum computing. The other thing to note is that many of the kind of interesting potential applications for quantum computing are in kind of a clean energy materials development space. So I think the hope is that even though you're using these for new applications, some of those applications could provide a huge net benefit by, for example, our team has done some work showing that a quantum computer could more exactly and efficiently simulate the molecular interactions in a fusion reactor to help make fusion energy a reality, and to help it operate as efficiently as possible, doing that work with the Department of Energy. We've also done work demonstrating quantum computers could simulate the chemical reaction to produce fertilizer, which accounts for something like 2-3% of global emissions because it's super inefficient. So if you could use a quantum computer to make that reaction more efficient, you could save a lot of emissions. So one thing that I think is really important to figure out ways to incentivize developments of those kinds of applications that will be helpful, which probably is not going to happen entirely organically. I mean, there's just the way capitalism works, right? So this is one of the things that our team did recently was sponsor an X Prize for quantum applications that are societally beneficial. And it's like a $5 million prize over the course of 3 years. And teams will compete to develop applications that essentially are in line with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And the hope is that if we see more kind of government industry funding for work that is really focused on these kinds of applications for quantum computing, that it will set us up for a thriving and also kind of net beneficial industry once we achieve these fault-tolerant quantum computers.
Yeah, so in our industry, materials modeling takes an incredible amount of compute, and it's an incredibly difficult problem. Can you figure out what the next silicon is or the next gallium nitride? And quantum compute is something that we're all hoping really breaks that open. So kind of on that, this is from the question bank, is what's the infrastructure that we need in the education system, and how do we give students access to quantum compute so that they can even start honestly thinking about the world as a quantum world? I mean, it's almost like there are quantum people and non-quantum people. And if you've not grown up understanding that, not being in this binary 0-1 world, it's almost difficult to put the problems together that way. So how's Google thinking about that? How's the quantum industry thinking about how we prepare the next generation of quantum scientists?
I think education and workforce is a really important topic. So you can look at this at a number of levels, right? Like, what is the people who are, young children now, like what can we be doing to just raise awareness even within the school system of quantum computing, quantum technologies? Obviously, you're not going to be like teaching a middle schooler to program a quantum computer, but there is in the US a national initiative, the Q12 partnership, to target K-12 students. And the philosophy behind that work is to use quantum as a way of getting kids excited about STEM and about careers in physics, engineering, et cetera. Because there is this kind of like, we don't exactly know this timescale where these jobs will be available, right? But it's probably helpful to get kids excited and get more kids going into these disciplines, regardless of the timeline for quantum computing, because there are many other careers that are also open to them. And that initiative has many partners. So Google, most of the major US quantum companies are partners and are doing things like participating in career days, providing resources like games, workshops that can be deployed in schools, funding for training teachers in quantum concepts so that they can bring that back into schools. And they're also working at the state level in the US to lobby for inclusion in curriculum. So I think efforts like that are important. As we go to higher education, there are a number of efforts in universities around the world in the US, but I know of several European universities as well who are developing quantum master's programs to combine kind of physics and engineering coursework and practical experience to train students for jobs in the quantum industry. There's a growing need as we scale the technology. When we started the team at Google, we primarily had PhD physicists working on this. But as we scale, as we expand our fab facility and build more processors, we need a lot more technicians, a lot more specialized engineers, and there is less awareness of this field and even in many engineering communities, but certainly the kinds of workers we would need on the technician side. So we have a collaboration with a university and community college in Santa Barbara, for example, where they train students. We're funding this program that trains students in clean room operations. And I think programs like that are super important for immediate workforce needs. And then there's also this finally, some need for sort of cross-disciplinary education to this point of getting people to think about quantum applications. In the long run, what we really need is people who are specialists in other disciplines, materials science, chemistry, biology, who can think, here's a problem where maybe I need a very exact molecular simulation that a quantum computer would be well suited to solve. And those conversations can be hard to have right now because the quantum algorithms, people know what's possible in the quantum computer. And a biologist has lots of ideas of problems, but can't kind of make the leap to, okay, this is something that would make sense to run on the quantum computer. It's the kind of problem that I would never be able to estimate with a classical computer. So I think some education there is really helpful too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, as a modeler by background, there's so many places that we just run into compute problems. And the same with, just computing overall. It started with physicists. The internet started with physicists. And eventually, none of those physicists probably would have anticipated, cat videos on the same technology they're inventing. So I think, another kind of question expounding on this talent that came from our internet here is on the talent pool in US versus Europe. Kind of what's happening. Looked like a lot of the quantum lab staff were European trained. Is there a desire to attract the deep technical expertise back to Europe? How is that playing out in the cross US Europe talent exchange?
Yeah. I mean, I think this is a frequent topic for many tech fields. And certainly for large multinational tech companies, for Google, there's definitely some kind of sensitivity around the attraction of much of this talent from other countries to the US, and sometimes a perception that this doesn't happen as much the other way around. I think so. There is a huge amount of talent in Europe, also in many parts of Asia. On our side, we are focused on attracting the best talent globally, but also building up these educational systems locally to address our needs in the short and long term. And I think the sort of whether the migration is happening in the other direction, that's really tied back to broader questions around how the ecosystem is developing and supported in those other countries. There are lots of opportunities to create value, I think, from quantum computing when it comes online. And we've had a lot of really successful collaborations with European companies, Covestro, Boehringer Ingelheim, several European automakers, to develop quantum computing applications. That kind of work one could expect to generate a ton of economic value once we have fault-tolerant quantum computers. So I think kind of thinking about that quantum ecosystem as a whole and looking for opportunities to build on existing strengths, in addition to obviously investing in hardware development, is really important. But sometimes the conversation becomes very focused on the hardware development and who is ahead in the hardware development, and it becomes very nationalistic. And that I think can lead to sort of a desire to not collaborate on some of these other spaces like applications, materials development, et cetera, which I understand, but also in the long run, it's probably leading to missed opportunities in those ancillary spaces too.
What you struck is an interesting balance here, right? Like all of these technologies are dual purpose. Same thing what we've seen with AI is how do we develop an open ecosystem? And on that side, how do you see, people starting to access quantum computing capability? And I think Google has some pilots where people can start to access and do some quantum. How are we actually going to walk through accessing quantum compute capability as the people on this call?
Yeah, so there are many of our peers do offer access to their quantum processors currently. Google has taken a different approach to that, and we do not offer broad commercial access. The thinking there is that you can't actually use today's quantum processors for anything useful, and we are trying to make progress as quickly as possible in development of the quantum computer so that we can get to the point where they are useful sooner, and then at that point would offer a commercial product. We do have a small program where we have a couple of external users accessing our processors to kind of test how it works, like look for potential useful applications for these early processors, and we'll slowly scale that up. The answer to how this will happen, I think I sort of said this earlier. I think one could expect it to be similar to a cloud computing model. You would access it, on your computer, and you need to know how to run algorithms on it, et cetera. There are various companies developing software for this. We at Google are also developing software, and many of the large tech players in this space are working in this kind of full stack way. There is a question there, of course, on how you manage what the quantum computers are used for, which at this point, we're working very closely with all of our users on what they are doing. And it's not the case that you can just it is, as you said earlier, a prototype. It's not like a plug and play. Our researchers need to be very involved in running things on our processors at the moment. And we adhere to Google's AI principles in determining what is and isn't run on them at this stage. But those questions around, they're familiar topics from some of the conversation in the cloud computing space on things like know your customer legislation, et cetera. And so hopefully we can learn from those as we start to need to think about access at a stage when we're not going to maybe have visibility into every algorithm that's being run.
Yeah, everything. So I just kind of back to that. So the bulk of the investment is still very much going into the improvement of quantum hardware back into cybersecurity, being our Shor's algorithm, that type of cybersecurity implications being the primary investment being driven by the nation states.
I would say, I think there's a recognition that quantum computers will be powerful for many kinds of applications. I've mentioned a few kind of molecular simulation applications. We also expect quantum computers to be able to solve differential equations faster than classical computers, which has all kinds of potential industrial applications. We think they will likely have some machine learning applications, not that they'll replace all machine learning, but in certain cases. So certainly Google's investment is because of this like large range of potential applications. I think the heightened interest from the national security community, I would say, is primarily driven by concern around the cryptanalysis capability. And also there are potential other national security relevant applications for even when you talk about materials and molecular simulation. You can imagine materials and molecules that are used for defense purposes, right? So yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So, and if you look at those two applications, are there differing research paths that are happening right now, or right now is it just, is everything very dual purpose in terms of the research path?
Everything is dual. So yeah. So I mean, I see. Yeah. So the investment, the part of this that's expensive is the hardware development, right? There's a lot of work happening on algorithms and applications. That's really important, but it's not the big cost. And it is all dual use at the moment. Yes, there is the potential, like if you found an early application in one of these spaces we've talked about, there's a potential that you could design a chip that would be particularly well suited to run that application. So there might be some R&D that became application specific if we were to discover some like really important early application, but the foundations of all of this and the bulk of the investment is really dual use. It's not like you can separate out what is needed for cryptanalysis versus various kinds of molecular simulation.
So eventually you'll have the tensor processing unit versus the straight CPU
Right.
of quantum. But right now we're not.
The thinking probably, I don't know for sure, but yeah, I think that's a possibility.
Yeah, no. So, I mean, I think let's go a little bit back to some of the post-quantum encryption and sort of how we should think about, we have about 7 minutes left, how we should think about living in this future quantum world. So what should we be thinking about doing, pushing for to prepare to reap the benefits of quantum without getting a lot of these externalities? I mean, I think if we design the internet different, if we'd known what we know now, we would have made some different choices 30 years ago. And so what are those things that we need to have on our radar now so that we live in a quantum world that's safe, that's, open access, and that's a world we want to live in?
Yeah. So, I mean, the migration to post-quantum cryptography is obviously one of the biggest things that needs to happen basically now, or needs to be started now. And that involves, as kind of talked a bit about, like inventories of existing cryptographic systems, and then eventually migration of those based on level of risk and priority. That is happening in some corners. Like there's in the US that there's been an executive order in, I think, 2022, and then there was some legislation last year requiring the government to do this. But I think there's a lot more that needs to happen to raise awareness amongst all the players that will need to undertake this migration and to provide kind of guidance to do that. So that's one thing. We talked a lot about workforce. I mean, workforce development is another issue that needs to be addressed soon. We talked a bit about just like being conscious of the societal implications, what kinds of applications what incentives we're providing for applications development, how to incentivize development of applications that will be good for the world. And I think that is really important. These conversations, as we start to see more commercial access and use of these computers, these conversations around like, how are we thinking about controls for that and what's required to access a quantum computer will become important too. And then I guess the other just like thing to think about for at a sort of government level at this point, I think is like what are the particular workforce ecosystem strengths of various countries, and how can they build on those to make sure that they're a part of a future quantum computing economy, basically.
Do you see that kind of on a more global effort? Does there need to be some more globalized body that's doing this, or can that happen kind of country to country?
I think, I mean, there are some global discussions of this happening. I don't think I would say there needs to be like a sort of formal legally binding forum for that, but it's good at this point that, so like the OECD, for example, has a forum on global future technologies with a quantum computing focus group. I think we've seen the OECD be a helpful venue for some of these early tech, like on AI, they've had pretty early conversations on like AI ethics, et cetera. So that's positive. We're also seeing a lot of discussion in other plurilateral forums, let's say, like the G7, the US EU Trade and Technology Council. There are various bilateral quantum agreements and cooperation agreements, essentially, and those are all important to ensure that we are working together as much as possible, working together with allies anyway, because this isn't like, it is going to be a global industry. There's no way one country can develop this on its own.
Yeah, and just material sourcing, labor sourcing, all of that. I mean, there's no way that this doesn't involve, much like compute, every country in the world. So I guess kind of for our final question, there's, like any emerging technology, you've got some risks, you've got some challenges, but why are you working in quantum, and what excites you most about a potentially quantum future? What are you really looking forward to in this space?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really exciting to be working on a technology at the stage where you have the ability to shape it, and where we have these hints of these really impactful, exciting applications like the fusion energy fertilizer. We've done some work on kind of modeling parts of biological molecules that interact with drugs, so would be really important for drug development. But we also know that we only have the tip of the iceberg. And so I think it's a really exciting time to be working in this space, to be able to like push for development of more of these exciting applications, to think about how we will handle these really tricky issues around access and equity. So, I mean, that's what excites me to be working in this space. And I think there are some, just in terms of the applications, what we know so far, and the fact that we don't know that much yet should hopefully excite people about the potential for the technology.
Well, I'm excited about the potential for quantum and the mix with classical compute. So I really want to thank you for your time, and thank you for kind of introducing us to the potential for quantum, some of the risks and some of the amazing applications, and really appreciate you taking the time here today.
Yeah, my
so
pleasure.
thank you, and thank you to our audience.
Thanks to everybody for joining. Yeah.